Under a sky scattered with countless stars, Lucas sat outside his secluded cabin nestled in the Colorado mountains. The ex-military pilot nursed a mug of coffee, the warmth in his hands contrasting the crisp mountain air. The jagged peaks around him loomed like silent guardians, their silhouettes carved against the starry sky. The stillness of the night was interrupted by a blinding flash across the heavens, forcing Lucas to shield his eyes. As the light dimmed, his breath caught, a fiery object hurtled through the atmosphere, trailing smoke as it plummeted toward the forested ridge nearby. Years of survival training kicked in, overriding any shock. Grabbing his emergency kit, Lucas raced into the darkness, his flashlight cutting through the cold night. His boots crunched over rocks and uneven terrain as he followed the smoke trail. Cresting the ridge, the acrid smell of burning metal assaulted him. Below, in a small clearing, lay the wreckage, twisted shards of metal strewn across the forest floor, with flickering flames licking the debris. This was no ordinary crash. The sleek design of the craft, adorned with glowing alien symbols, suggested a far more mysterious origin. Cautiously, Lucas approached the wreckage, scanning the remains. His light passed over strange etchings on the ship, pulsing with an eerie blue light. A weak, gasping sound drew his attention. Beneath a piece of the craft's shimmering hull lay a figure, partially buried. He lifted the debris to reveal a woman, or something close. Her skin shimmered with a soft, iridescent blue glow. Her delicate features were almost human, but her violet eyes and the strange markings on her skin told a different story. She was alive, but just barely. Alien blood oozed from her wounds, staining the ground beneath her. Lucas's military instincts kicked in as he knelt beside her. "I'm here to help," he muttered, more to himself than her. Her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his with a mix of fear and desperation. She tried to speak, but only managed a pained whisper. "Don't talk," Lucas urged softly, applying pressure to the worst of her wounds. With great care, he lifted her in his arms. She was surprisingly light, almost fragile. The journey back to his cabin was grueling, each step taken cautiously to avoid jostling his injured passenger. His mind raced. Who was she? What had brought her here? And what would happen now? By the time Lucas reached his cabin, sweat drenched his shirt despite the mountain chill. He gently laid the alien girl on his bed and began treating her injuries. She watched him with those vivid violet eyes, filled with a mix of pain, confusion, and gratitude. As dawn broke, casting hues of pink and gold over the landscape, Lucas sat beside her, exhaustion weighing him down. The alien girl had drifted into a fitful sleep, her breathing steadier now. "What am I going to call you?" he whispered to the silence. Then, as if a forgotten memory stirred, a name surfaced. "Ava," he said softly. "I'll call you Ava." Days passed, and Ava began to heal at an astonishing rate. Though they couldn't communicate with words, an understanding grew between them. Ava's gestures became more expressive, pointing at objects around the cabin with curiosity. Lucas would name them for her, and sometimes she'd respond with melodic trills and clicks, likely her own language. One afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the windows, Ava pointed to the sky, then to herself. Lucas nodded. "You're from up there," he said. "But why are you here? What happened?" Ava's face tightened with frustration, her hands moving rapidly as if mimicking conflict. "You're running from something," Lucas guessed. She nodded, her eyes filled with urgency. Then, with a regal motion, she drew herself up and gestured, indicating importance. Lucas furrowed his brow. "You're someone important, involved in some kind of political conflict, and you had to escape." Relief washed over Ava's face as she grasped his hand in gratitude, her cool, smooth skin sending a shock through him. As days turned into weeks, Lucas and Ava grew closer, sharing silent moments of connection. One crisp morning, he led her outside for the first time since her crash. Ava marveled at the beauty of Earth's nature, her blue fingers tracing the delicate texture of grass, her eyes wide with wonder. A butterfly landed on a nearby flower, and Ava let out a musical trill that made Lucas smile. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, gesturing to the mountains. But even in these moments of peace, Lucas knew Ava's time on Earth was limited. She needed to contact her people. Together, they unearthed his old ham radio equipment, and after hours of scanning through frequencies, Ava finally found a signal. Her fingers danced over the controls as she communicated with a voice on the other end, their alien words a symphony of sounds. When the conversation ended, Ava turned to Lucas, her face filled with a mix of joy and trepidation. "Your people are coming," he said softly. Ava nodded, holding up 3 fingers, indicating how long they had. 3 days. As the sun set that night, they sat on the porch, gazing up at the stars. Lucas's mind raced with thoughts of what would come next. His life had already changed, and in 3 days, it would change again. The next morning, however, an unsettling feeling crept over him. Something wasn't right. As Lucas prepared breakfast, he sensed they weren't alone. Ava felt it too, her body tensing. "We need to be careful," Lucas whispered. Just then, a twig snapped outside the cabin. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle mounted above the fireplace, but before he could react, the window shattered, and a canister of smoke rolled inside. Chaos erupted. Through the haze, a humanoid figure stormed through the door, its gray skin and glowing green eyes giving it an otherworldly appearance. Lucas yelled for Ava to run, throwing himself at the attacker. They grappled, knocking over furniture as the alien's strength threatened to overwhelm him. But before it could land a fatal blow, a piercing shriek echoed through the cabin. Ava stood in the doorway, her hands raised. The air around her seemed to ripple as the alien screamed in pain, clutching its head. Lucas stumbled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest as the alien invader writhed on the floor, clutching its head in agony. The air around Ava shimmered with a strange energy, her violet eyes glowing brighter as she focused on the intruder. It was as if she had tapped into some unknown power, one Lucas had never seen her use before. With a final, strangled cry, the alien collapsed, its breathing shallow but steady. Ava lowered her hands, the energy around her fading. She turned to Lucas, her face a mix of fear and urgency. He could see her trembling, the toll of whatever ability she had just used evident in the way her shoulders sagged. "Ava," Lucas said, rushing to her side. "Are you okay?" She nodded weakly, but her eyes flicked back to the unconscious alien on the floor. Lucas followed her gaze, his grip tightening on the rifle in his hand. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. "We need to move," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "There could be more of them." Ava's eyes widened, and she nodded, quickly turning to gather her few belongings. Lucas knelt beside the invader, his military training kicking in as he searched the creature for any useful information. Its breathing was shallow, its body limp, but alive. It wore some sort of armor, sleek and gray like its skin, with a series of blinking lights on a device strapped to its wrist. Before Lucas could investigate further, Ava let out a panicked sound. She was by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where dark shapes moved through the trees. More of them, coming fast. "Damn it," Lucas muttered. "We need to go now." He grabbed Ava's hand, and they bolted out the back door, slipping into the dense forest behind the cabin. His mind raced. He knew these mountains well, but with Ava's people only days away and these invaders closing in, he didn't have much time. They moved quickly through the trees, Lucas leading them down a narrow path only he knew existed. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, getting closer with every second. Ava stumbled behind him, clearly struggling to keep up. Her strength was still returning, and whatever power she'd used back in the cabin had drained her even more. Lucas slowed, pulling her arm over his shoulder to help her move faster. "I've got you," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. They reached a small cave nestled in the side of a rocky hill. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. Lucas led Ava inside, crouching near the entrance to peer through the thick brush that hid the opening. The dark shapes in the distance were closing in, their movements fast and coordinated. "They're tracking us," Lucas whispered, his mind racing. "They must have some sort of technology that's leading them right to us." Ava knelt beside him, her eyes filled with frustration and fear. She pointed to herself and then mimicked a small device, tapping her wrist like the one the alien had worn. Then, she pointed out into the forest. "They have a tracker on you," Lucas guessed. Ava nodded, her expression grim. Lucas cursed under his breath. That's why they had found them so quickly. He had to figure out a way to disable the tracker or they'd never escape. But there was no time now, those creatures were too close. He glanced around the cave, trying to come up with a plan. "We'll hold out here," he said. "Let them pass. Then, we'll disable whatever's tracking you." Ava nodded, her body tense. They sat in silence, listening as the footsteps grew closer. Lucas could hear the low murmurs of alien voices now, strange and guttural. His grip tightened on the rifle. If it came to a fight, he wasn't sure he could take them all down, especially with Ava in her weakened state. The shapes moved past the cave, close enough that Lucas could see the eerie green glow of their eyes through the thick trees. His heart pounded in his chest, but he held his breath, keeping as still as possible. Ava clutched his arm, her breathing shallow as they watched the invaders move by. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity, but finally, the shapes faded into the distance. Lucas exhaled slowly, motioning for Ava to stay quiet a little longer. Once he was sure they were safe, he turned to her. "Now," he whispered, "we need to get rid of that tracker." Ava nodded, her face set with determination. She pulled up the sleeve of her tunic, revealing a small, faintly glowing mark on her wrist. Lucas leaned in, inspecting it closely. It wasn't like anything he'd ever seen before, a strange, pulsating light beneath her skin. "I don't know how to disable this," he muttered. "But we have to try." Ava gestured for him to step back, then closed her eyes, concentrating hard. Her hands hovered over the glowing mark, and once again, Lucas saw the strange ripple of energy around her. She winced in pain, her body shaking as she focused. The light beneath her skin flickered, then dimmed, before finally winking out. Ava slumped forward, breathing heavily. Lucas caught her before she fell, holding her steady as she regained her composure. "You did it," he whispered, relief flooding through him. But their victory was short-lived. A sharp whine cut through the air, a signal. Lucas's heart sank as he looked up, scanning the sky. In the distance, a sleek, black ship descended toward the forest, its lights sweeping across the trees. They had been found again. "We have to move," Lucas said, pulling Ava to her feet. "They know where we are." With no time to rest, they sprinted through the forest, the whine of the alien ship growing louder behind them. Lucas's mind raced. He needed a plan, and fast. They couldn't outrun a ship, and Ava was too weak to keep using her abilities. As they reached the edge of a clearing, Lucas paused, looking back at Ava. Her eyes met his, filled with trust and something else. Fear, yes, but something deeper, more personal. She squeezed his hand, and he knew then, no matter what happened, he wasn't just protecting her because she was important to some interstellar conflict. He was protecting her because, somewhere along the way, she had become important to him. "I'm not letting them take you," he vowed. Ava's gaze softened, a silent thank you in her violet eyes. Just then, the ship's spotlight swept over the clearing, locking onto them. Lucas raised his rifle, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The ship's spotlight blazed across the clearing, casting long, sharp shadows through the trees. Lucas stood firm, his rifle steady despite the pounding of his heart. Ava was at his side, her violet eyes wide with fear and determination, still glowing faintly as she gathered whatever strength she had left. The whine of the alien ship grew louder, its sleek black form descending from the sky like a predator closing in on its prey. "Stay behind me," Lucas whispered, his voice low but firm. He wasn't sure what they were up against, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let them take her. The ship hovered above the ground, stirring up a cloud of dust and leaves as it came to a halt just above the clearing. Its hull was a dark, reflective black, almost liquid in appearance, with strange symbols glowing faintly along its surface. A door hissed open, and a ramp extended, a metallic clang echoing through the forest. From the shadows of the ship, more of the gray-skinned aliens emerged, their glowing green eyes scanning the forest with a cold, predatory gaze. There were 4 of them this time, each one armed with sleek, futuristic weapons that pulsed with an ominous hum. Lucas gripped his rifle tighter. "Ava," he said, glancing over his shoulder at her. "If things go south, you run. Don't wait for me." Ava's eyes flashed with defiance, and she shook her head, stepping up beside him. She pointed to herself, then to Lucas, and finally to the approaching aliens. Her meaning was clear. We face this together. Lucas clenched his jaw. There was no time to argue, and in truth, he didn't want to. They had come too far for him to protect her by pushing her away. The lead alien stepped forward, its green eyes narrowing as it spotted them. It spoke in a guttural, unfamiliar language, but its tone was clear, an order to surrender. Lucas didn't move, his rifle trained on the alien's chest. He wasn't going to fire unless he had to, but he wasn't going to back down, either. The alien hissed something else, raising its weapon. "Now!" Lucas shouted, diving to the side as a blast of energy crackled through the air, scorching the ground where he had stood. He rolled into a crouch, firing off a shot from his rifle. The bullet ricocheted off the alien's armor with a metallic ping, doing little more than knocking it back a step. Ava was already in motion. Her hands glowed with the same strange energy as before, and the air around her rippled as she focused her power. She threw her hands forward, and a shock wave of invisible force slammed into the aliens, sending two of them tumbling backward. But it wasn't enough to stop them. The remaining two aliens recovered quickly, their weapons humming with deadly energy as they fired in rapid succession. Lucas darted behind a tree, narrowly avoiding the blast. The heat from the shot singed the bark, leaving a blackened scar in its wake. He glanced at Ava. She was struggling, her energy faltering after using her powers twice in such a short time. Her face was pale, her breath coming in shallow gasps. They couldn't keep this up. Not for long. Lucas's mind raced. They needed a way out, something to even the odds. The forest around them was dense, but the clearing they stood in left them exposed. The ship hovered above, a constant threat. And the aliens were relentless, moving with the cold precision of trained soldiers. Then it hit him. The ship. "Ava!" he called out, ducking behind another tree as another blast ripped through the air. "The ship. We have to get to the ship." Ava turned to him, her face filled with confusion at first, but then understanding dawned in her eyes. If they could get inside the alien ship, they might have a chance. It was a long shot, but it was better than being gunned down in the open. Lucas fired another shot, this time aiming for the ship's ramp. It clanged off the metal, drawing the attention of the aliens for just a moment, but it was enough. "Go!" he shouted, and they both sprinted toward the ship. The aliens reacted instantly, their weapons trained on them as they ran. Lucas could feel the heat of the blasts whizzing past them, too close for comfort. But they were almost there, just a few more steps. They reached the base of the ramp, and Lucas shoved Ava ahead of him. "Get inside," he ordered, turning to fire one last shot to cover their escape. The bullet hit one of the aliens in the leg, sending it stumbling. It wasn't much, but it bought them enough time. Ava scrambled into the ship, her hands moving frantically over the controls as Lucas followed. The inside of the ship was sleek and futuristic, with glowing panels and strange alien symbols everywhere. He didn't understand any of it, but Ava seemed to know what she was doing. Her fingers danced over the console, and the ship shuddered to life. "Can you fly this thing?" Lucas asked, breathless, as he slammed the door shut behind them. Ava glanced at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but she nodded. Then, she pointed to a series of controls on the far side of the cockpit and gestured for him to help. Lucas didn't know what half of the buttons did, but he followed her instructions, pressing the switches she indicated. The ship lurched, rising slightly off the ground as the engines roared to life. Outside, the remaining aliens scrambled to stop them, firing their weapons at the ship's hull. The blasts rocked the craft, but Ava was already pulling them higher, away from the ground and out of reach. Lucas's heart pounded as they shot through the trees, the ship shaking as it gained altitude. The alien ship they had taken was fast, faster than anything Lucas had ever seen. He couldn't believe they were actually doing this. They were escaping. For a moment, it seemed like they had made it. The ground fell away beneath them, the forest shrinking into the distance as they ascended into the sky. But then, a warning alarm blared, and Ava's face paled. "What's wrong?" Lucas asked, panic creeping into his voice. Ava pointed frantically to the console. One of the screens flickered with a strange alien script, and though Lucas couldn't read it, he didn't need to. A red light blinked ominously, and through the cockpit window, he could see another ship approaching, larger, more heavily armed, and heading straight for them. "We've got company," Lucas muttered. Ava's hands flew over the controls as the ship accelerated, weaving through the clouds in a desperate attempt to evade their pursuer. The larger ship fired, and the alien vessel shuddered violently as the blast grazed them, but they kept moving, narrowly avoiding another hit. Lucas gritted his teeth, gripping the sides of his seat as Ava steered them into a steep climb. They shot upward, the atmosphere thinning as they broke through the cloud cover. But the enemy ship was relentless, gaining on them with every passing second. "Come on, come on," Lucas muttered, his knuckles white as he braced for impact. Then, suddenly, the ship jolted forward with a burst of speed, and Ava let out a triumphant cry. The larger ship fell behind, its weapons firing in vain as they shot toward the stars. They had escaped. Lucas slumped back in his seat, his chest heaving with relief. Beside him, Ava looked equally exhausted, but a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She had done it. "We're not out of this yet," Lucas said, his voice rough from the tension. "But that was incredible." Ava looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude, and something deeper. They had survived. For now. But as they sailed into the vastness of space, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that their real battle had only just begun.